Thanks for coming to Community First Open Source and Action Plan. My name is Pavithra. I work as a developer advocate at Quantsite. And my co-presenter for this talk, as you might have seen, was Tanya Allard. However, she couldn't be here today. So I'll be presenting this talk on behalf of her and a whole team of people, actually. OK, so let's start with what is Community First Open Source. Let's think about why I'm giving this talk and start there. So for the scope of this presentation, at least, we can broadly classify open source software into company-backed and community-driven. By company-backed, I mean projects that are created and maintained by a single or maybe a handful of companies, organizations, entities, right? And they are the primary stakeholders. They're the ones who make most of the decisions. And there are a lot of advantages to this approach. That's why it's a thing. And some of these advantages are faster iteration cycles. You can have quicker decisions. You can have dedicated funding and a lot more. So there is a reason these exist. And on the other hand, we have community-driven open source projects, for example, the Jupyter project, that are driven, developed, and governed by the community as a whole. And by community, I mean everybody who interacts with your project. This is a broad group, as you can see. You have users, contributors, advocates, maintainers, but also folks in the downstream and upstream project community. So this is a really, really broad group of people, and a single company or entity are just one, they're part of this community, okay? So that's what I mean by these two terms. And this community-driven projects can be a path to long-term sustainability, I think, because of openly documented decisions and investing in contributors, among other things. It's not the path, but it's a path. And that's why this talk is about moving from company-backed projects to community-driven open source projects. It's very specific, right? And you may be asking why. Anybody thinking why? At JupyterCon? Yeah, I see. So, two things. First is we are working on doing this, and our reason is long-term sustainability. It can be different reasons for different people, right? The project I am representing today is called Nebari. It was previously called QHub, if folks know about that. And we are moving, we are in this process. We are doing this transition. We are not there yet, but yeah. And we have taken inspiration from a lot of open source projects, the Kubernetes project, the Jupyter community, NumPy and SciPy, a lot of in the scientific Python space, right? Gatsby project, actually. We borrowed a lot of documentation principles from them. So we've gone through the process to figure out how to do this. And this talk is about just creating a more structured approach if more folks want to do this, right? And it's here at JupyterCon because sure, the actual action plan may not be something all of you use, but there may be parts of this talk that can help a lot of folks. So that's why I'm giving this talk here. OK, so I keep talking about an action plan. It consists of 3 steps. We'll start with some guiding principles. We'll go to some project management foundations, building on top of these principles, and then finally discuss how to enable contributions. All right, so jumping into the action plan now, guiding principles. So now, once you've decided to make a transition, this is a milestone for your project, right? So it's a good opportunity to take a step back, think about just a lot of things you wouldn't usually, which are starting with users. At the end of the day, an open source project is for its users, right? So that's why we are starting here. And we want to be thinking about who are your existing users and how would that group change as you make this transition, and what do they care about? So an example here from Nebari is what I'm showing here. So data scientists, ML engineers, just thinking about what tools do they use, what are their pain points, what are their core needs. And it doesn't need to be this documented. You can just have a general informal chat as well yeah, that's a thing for pretty much everything I'll be talking about today. So after users and their journeys, you want to be thinking about core values. Core values for how folks will contribute and collaborate. So some examples of core values from our project are accessibility and inclusion, vendor-agnostic development, high standards of security. These are just 3 examples. We have lots. We have a few different core values, and it will be different for each project. And that's why you want to be aligning folks on your team and building these foundations to move forward. And a nice tool to represent both of these core values and user journeys is a vision board. So this is a framework. There are lots of different frameworks available on the internet. So we start with just a few lines describing the project and that all of us agree on, like all of your team members agree on. And then think about your community, their needs, what the project is going to look like, and what your final goals are. This is an example from Nibari. It's incomplete, but that's kind of why I'm sharing it. Like, it doesn't need to be perfect, right? All right, so guiding principles, you've created these. Step 0, actually, the fundamentals. Then we can move on to project management foundation. So we have a direction with your principles. Now you can expand on it with some concrete project management resources, which are creating a license, code of conduct, message and brand, repository management, communication channels, and governance. So you may realize you can do some of these simultaneously, right? However, I would encourage you to think about like message and brand before repository management and communication channels, because you may find that it helps you. For example, you change your project name, then you change everything else, right? So there is some structure to this, but it's not super strict. Okay, let's go through these one by one. Starting with a license. Open source, licenses are at the core of open source. Just because your project is on GitHub doesn't mean it's open source, right? So this is an opportunity to think about if you want to change your license, right? And not just what the license for your project looks like, but what licenses will you expect projects interacting with your project to have, and what others will expect your project to have. Like, users may prefer some licenses over the others. So thinking about all of these things and making a decision about you want to continue with your license, change it, what it'll look like. So an example here for Nibari is we continued with the BSD 3-clause license. It's a permissive license, and it fit with our core values. I'm going to tie everything back to that. All right. So equally, if not more important, for an open source project, especially if you're moving to a community-driven project and folks are interacting with your project, is a code of conduct. And here, we need both a policy and an enforcement strategy. These are a few that I personally like, and that's why I've shared it here. I'll share the slides as well for folks who are interested. These are all linked resources. And as an example, for Nibari, we went with SciPy's code of conduct. Turing-based code of conduct, and we adopted SciPy's diversity statement. Because, again, these matched with our core values. We wanted to be explicit, and we found Turing-based COC to be super explicit. And inclusivity and accessibility was part of our core values as well. So SciPy's diversity statement fit well with that. For enforcement, it doesn't have to be super fancy, but you need to have a structure. So for us, it's very simple. It's a reporting form. And we have a 2-person COC committee, okay? And as a side note, if you have the resources and bandwidth, it's useful and important for the folks responding to incidents if they have some training around how to do that properly, okay? Okay, so these two done. Next is the fun creative parts, message and brand. So here we're thinking about your project name, tagline, messages, like how you speak about your project, the brand, the colors your project uses, your logo, if all of these fit well with your new values, right? This is our turn to turn on the creative parts of your brains. And for Nibari, as an example, okay, you can lie anywhere on the spectrum. You can just choose to keep your original resources as is. For Nibari, it was a complete overhaul, and it was super fun. We started with the mood board. We had like all these crazy ideas, and then we funneled them down. So yeah, the project was called QHub. Now it's Nibari. I've also included the why choose Nibari because we talked about and aligned on what kind of messages and what we care about deeply and what we want to share with folks. Okay. Repository management. So after we have a new name, we went on to get the GitHub organization for Nibari. So again, this is just another project management. Sorry, repository management includes a lot of things, which is hosting platforms. Not a lot of folks prefer GitHub, and that's completely okay. And this is your chance to make that decision for your team. Structure, like do you want to split your project into more or like combine things? Big change movements. Issues, PRs, labels, this and templates. So when we move to community-driven approaches, we want to add more context to everything. Like there are things that happened just implicitly and folks knew about things, but as we move to a more public, open space, we need to share that context very clearly and very explicitly. So labels and issues honestly help a lot, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. Project boards and milestones. How are you going to do, like how will you decide what to work on next, and where will it live, so that everyone can contribute to it. So as an example for Nibari, those labels are, all the credit goes to Tanya Allard there. She's awesome. This is just, honestly, I'd not know how to fit all of our labels on the screen, so I've just given you a very, very tiny subset. But as I said, this helps add so much more context than a regular issue would, right? And for Nibari specifically, as an example, we decided to create a separate repo for our documentation, a separate one for Docker images, which was all initially a part of one big code repo. So we took an opportunity to structure and rearrange things. Another example for repository management is this .github repository that we have, which contains all of the community health documents, which is our templates for writing really good context, high context issues and PRs. And these are synced across all the other Nibari repositories with the GitHub actions. So we're also trying to make it easy for folks to do this well. Next is communication channels. All of your communication now needs to move to a different place if it wasn't already in the open. I'll add that disclaimer, okay. And here we're thinking about support and development. So these are two different things. And then if you have any synchronous meetings, where will they go, or if you actually want to have meetings, and where will the notes live? And finally, if you want any social media channels for your project, if they weren't already a thing, right? For Nibari, we went with GitHub discussions, because GitHub was the tool of choice. For the support channel, we have all the development chat happening on issues, sometimes on discussions, and all of our meeting notes are on HackMD, publicly available and documented in our documentation as well. Okay. Lastly, but actually quite importantly for a transition, is governance. So you want to align with your team on who makes decisions and how these decisions are made. And this can be like an RFD process, or it can be an enhancement proposal, right? And you also, at this stage, if it wasn't already explicitly mentioned anywhere, you want to create teams, like who are your core maintainers, or like any structure that you want to follow for your project's governance, and what permissions do they have, and how it changes over time. So yeah, all of these are project management like fundamentals that we've laid down. Step 3 is enabling contributions. So this part of the talk is, honestly, it can be its own talk or a workshop, because it's that broad a topic. But I am going to talk about only, again, the foundations and things you can do beforehand to make this process easier. Okay? So a few things we can do is have explicit roadmaps and document your release cycles and mechanisms, or change them if they already existed, right? And have clear pathways and guidelines for both maintainers and contributors and sustainers, like everyone who's going to interact with your project. Just having some documentation and explicit documentation is going to help your project in the future as you move. So roadmap and releases, I think self-explanatory, right? Priorities in the short term, long term, and release mechanism as well as release cadence. How you probably already have these in some way, so it may just be making these public, or you want to think about how you want to do this. Folks' bandwidth usually changes after this transition, so you want to make sure your new release mechanism abides by those new bandwidths that folks have. So these are just a couple of examples from Nibari. We have a very clear, explicit roadmap with themes, not just for engineering, but also design and community support. So folks can come in and see what we're working on and help out where they can, as well as a release process. So we changed from Semver to Calver when we moved projects, but that's up to you and your team. Contributor guidelines and paths. If you can, I would highly encourage you to create documentation and guidelines for code as well as low and non-code contributors. And that can look like all of these areas, but not limited to these areas. We are still in the process of creating these. All of these don't exist yet, but that's the place we want to reach, I suppose. And I think if all projects reach that stage, it's going to help our community a lot. As well as for contributor docs are just one step to contributing, but after contributing, folks want to move on to take more responsibility. And for that, we have maintainers and sustainer documentation. This is for not only, this also helps your existing maintainer group because things are changing, right? And we want to make sure everyone knows that that's happening, and new folks who want to become maintainers can be on the same playing field as much as we try with the existing folks. So we want existing folks to follow these new guidelines, as well as it'll help new people. And some options here are having very clear, explicit guidelines around triaging, how to review code, if you have saved replies to help new contributors, because honestly, when you're maintaining projects, you're writing the same thing over and over again for like ever. So saved replies are awesome, especially on GitHub, if you're using GitHub. So again, just a few options and examples from our project, but this is here as something you want to think about and talk with your team about. So yeah, those were that was the action plan. It's not complete, but it's the first few steps you want to start taking. And you will need to keep reminding folks, especially existing folks, that things are changing and we do things differently now. So expect this, and it will take time. This is not going to happen overnight. So we are still in the process. We started this like 6-8 months ago, and we are still working through these, right? And the second is all of these resources that we created will keep evolving, and a good way to do that is just be open to feedback, especially from new folks, right? And with that, I'm going to say thank you. This is everything we talked about. If you don't remember, which, yeah, I'll share the slides later. But yeah, I'll open for questions now.
Thanks a lot for this talk. Are there any questions? Okay, in this case, I have one. So when you have a company project that becomes open source, how do you, I mean, this is a bit what you explained, but how do you make sure that the roadmap that's written is also contributed by people outside of the company?
So when you start, it's probably going to be your core team. But what we try to do is review in the open regularly, like in a community meeting, so that folks have an opportunity to share feedback and add to the roadmap. So yeah, when you refresh the roadmap each time, make sure it's in the open and folks get a chance to share their thoughts. And the roadmap itself is probably hosted somewhere, so we have it on GitHub, so folks can also open issues against it to say, hey, this is another thing you should focus on.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, there's another question.
Hello.
Hi.
What triggered your decision to kind of like evolve your organizations to like choose to implement more structure?
To implement more structure or move towards community-driven as an approach? Yeah, right. A few things. So I'll start by saying I work at Quantsite, and Quantsite's like the whole idea and the mission is open source sustainability, right? And I did mention that long-term sustainability is one of the reasons that we moved, and that's the primary reason, honestly. So QHub has existed for over 2 years now, but it was very Quantsite first, and it was open source from the beginning. I told you it was under the BSC3+ license, but only Quantsite sort of held reins around governance and contributed to the project. But as a project, it's a Jupyter Hub distribution, just because I didn't mention it. And the idea is to make the deployment story around Jupyter Hub for folks slightly easier, right? And that helps a lot of people. And we just figured, yeah, moving towards a more community-first governance helps more folks adopt it as well, right? Because the project is overall more healthy that way. Any other questions?
There's a lot of questions.
So thank you very much for your talk. I wonder how can you encourage more kind of contribution, even like leadership for people maybe underrepresented at the moment?
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very deep question. I don't think I can do justice to that question, but I'll try. That's an unsolved problem, honestly, and we are trying, and that's all we can do. We can try our best, right? Yeah, all of these are a good first step. But also, I don't know if folks are aware, there's a contributor experience project going on where there are like, NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib. We have folks trying to make and improve the contributor experience for folks, and initiatives like that where you put in dedicated resources, stay in touch with folks, super responsive. Like responsiveness helps, honestly, especially for first-time contributors, right? And having clear paths helps a lot. Mentorship, if you can. Honestly, that's how I got involved in open source. I don't think I could have if it wasn't for the awesome folks at Bokeh, and like, yeah, all of these things, and trying our best to do.
That's a very good answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. Yeah, and I'm also wondering, as maybe a lot of us are working for a for-profit company who maybe developed some projects that were, initially for clients that, apparently, for commercial use. And I'm wondering what kind of conversations, if I want to help my company move a little bit to more community direction, and maybe publish some of the source code and some of the ideas to the outside, to the real world. And I wonder what I should do to start that conversation, or how would you address this in a way that is more open and acceptable to management, for example.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not the best person to answer this because I've been very lucky in my life, and I've only worked in places that understand and value community first and community-driven open source, right? I will open this question to folks if you have a better answer, but where my mind is going to first is, well, you can share the story of community-driven projects, and especially projects that have found success, right? Have found a community, and like, there are a lot of projects, especially in the scientific Python space, that are community first, but a lot of companies rely on them and use them, and the overall story is better in a way, right? Yeah, Carol?
Just last question.
Oh, no, I think she's
No, I think I was going to just share a little bit. I think these are the steps, and by showing your employer, like, okay, these are the logical steps to go through. A lot of times there's value in internal code, but even maybe internal code that you're not using all that frequently, but somebody in the open source community could use. By open sourcing it, you're giving other folks the opportunity to adopt it and continue to maintain it. The other time I have seen it be beneficial is if you have a project that you're actively working on, but could scale much quicker because you brought in community members. But as soon as you make it a community project, you're no longer in charge of the project. You know, you'd still have a company-maintained open source, but once you make that jump to community. So, you know, it's totally fine to start with company-based and move over. And my one question was, what did you find as the most challenging item in that whole list of things?
That it's I think everyone, so usually it's like a couple of folks. Actually, Tanya championed a lot of the work, right, that I'm talking about today. So huge shout out to Tanya. So we have a couple of folks who can champion most of the documentation and like start these discussions. Folks want to contribute, but you need someone to like gather the thoughts, put these together. But I think the most challenging in the long term is keeping it up, right? It's not a one-time thing. You need to remind folks, keep evolving your docs, and keep reminding people that this is the direction we want to go in. So that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.